Merry Christmas. Happy New Year. The bottle stopper was on top of an old bourbon bottle. On top of the stopper was an old man with a big red nose. He looked like a leprechaun, but his eyes were glazed over and his cheeks were flush. He had a sheepish grin. You could tell that he'd been drinking too much. Yet despite his tipsiness, every Christmas he would end up in her nativity scene by the manger right next to the baby Jesus. Here where Mary and Joseph kept silent vigil, here where shepherds knelt in adoration, in the midst of them all was this bottle stopper with this old man on the top, smiling drunk. Who put him there? Her husband. He was a sailor on the Great Lakes, the captain of an ore freighter, just like the one that you can see down by I-280 by the new bridge, the Veterans Bridge in downtown Toledo. On the Sunday after Thanksgiving, this woman would always put up her nativity scene. She'd put it up in her hallway by the front door. And then she would wait for his ship to come in from its last voyage, usually from Duluth to Cleveland, just before the winter ice would set in. Usually layup time came maybe a week before Christmas. Whatever day it was, the captain would burst through that front door and swallow her up in his arms. And after a big kiss, he would go back to the front hallway, and there, just to tease her and irritate her, he would drop the bottle stopper right in the middle of the nativity scene, right next to the baby Jesus. Oh, she'd complain. She'd say, "Gil, don't do that. You're ruining the scene. It's sacrilegious." But he'd do it anyway. As he said, Jesus takes them all, even my drinking buddy. Putting the drunk by the baby Jesus, it was the captain's Christmas ritual. There in the hallway, the baby Jesus and the smiling drunk would greet everyone who entered the house. I guess it was a way for the captain to say, "Gil's back home again." The captain wasn't a religious man. I can't remember that he ever went to church. But no matter, he had one thing right. And what was that? Jesus takes them all. Jesus takes them all. That's hard for us to understand. For our world cuts out certain people. It differentiates between rich and poor. It differentiates between strong and weak, important people and insignificant people. It differentiates between. It says, this person is worthwhile, but you are not. Certain people, the poor, the weak, the despised, they are sent away to the other side of the tracks, to the ghetto, to the ash heap. And that is wrong. Very wrong. That's what Hitler did. He wanted the perfect race, the super race. A nation where only the strong, the beautiful, the handsome, the smart, where only they could exist. He thought he knew the way to accomplish this state of perfection. All he needed to do was to weed out the weak, the old, the sick, the mentally incompetent. And for good measure, he also threw in the Jew, the gypsy, and those who were gay. The trouble was he had a never-ending list. There's always some other group that he thought he needed to call that threatened his dream of a super race. So out of his obsession for perfection came the gas chambers, the concentration camps, the furnaces. No, none of us are Hitlers, but we all have these tendencies toward perfection, and I want to tell you about one that I have. It was the way that I used to paint windows. Cutting in a window pane is a very precise job and takes patience. So when I painted a window, I tried to be very, very careful not to get paint upon the glass, but always on the frame. And that's when my need for perfection would enter in. Usually when I had gotten done, I had a little bit of paint on the glass, but still I was compelled to somehow get that paint off the glass. And what would happen when I tried to wipe it off? Invariably, that little smudge would turn into a bigger smudge. And so I learned it was better to leave my mistakes alone and let the paint stay where it lay. Perfection. I wanted a pane of glass to be perfect without a single drop of paint. And yet pressing for perfection just made matters worse. Wanting to cut out all that is imperfect, striving for the ideal, it's a downfall of many people. The desire for perfection, was that not the reason that Emperor Augustus demanded that all the world should be enrolled? With his census, he could find out just how strong his empire was. But his census had ramifications beyond the strong. He would also find out just how weak his empire was, and then he could get rid of that was deemed by him not worthy of keeping. He would keep the things that made his empire strong: the soldiers, swords and spears, bins of grain, iron ingots and gold, sailing ships and cargo vessels, slaves and skilled craftsmen. But old people who just used up resources, who contributed very little, leopards who could not be cured, crazy people who shouted and yelled obscene things, the crippled and the lame who could never march in his armies, a peasant mother and her son. What were they? How could they help his empire? On that night so long ago, the emperor didn't care what would happen to a baby and his mother. He was sure that they could never be of help. For who would ever need a peasant woman and her baby son? And that's how kings and emperors and those in power usually think of those who live so far below, whose lives they never see. In this world, there are too many kings cutting people out, judging who should stay and who should go. In their grand plans, the weak, the poor, and those whose futures seem unpromising have no place. Those who have no prospects, who will take them in? Is it not this baby Jesus that lies in a manger? Jesus is the King who accepts us all, who loves every single creature, big and small, the poor, the rich, the weak, the strong, the shepherd and the king. God's infant Son reaches to them all, even the bad, the worst of sinners. To them, through this child, God extends his hand of welcome. The infant Son leaves no one out. And that's why angels sing. That's why stars shine. And that's why shepherds kneel on this holy night. For in this manger lies the baby Jesus, God's instrument of peace. For God's sake, Jesus' sake, God comes to everyone. For on this night, there is love for all. Of the Great Lakes captain, I did not tell you all the story. Over 50 years ago, this captain has been dead. They found him lying in his bed on his ship in the harbor at Buffalo, dead from too much drink. No, he wasn't perfect. He never said he was. But he was loved. And every Christmas Eve, until she died, his wife remembered him. For there in her hallway, I can still see the nativity scene. And I'm sure you know what's in it. There lies the bottle stopper, right next to the Virgin Mother and her Holy Child. Yes, even the smiling drunk, with a whiskey bottle in his hand, could be found by the manger, praising God on high. For on this night, this Christmas night, the baby Jesus takes in all, even the man on the whiskey bottle stop. Let us pray.